The rain hammered the scrapyard of Vanguard Motors, turning the industrial graveyard into a soup of rust and hydraulic fluid. Julian Sterling, the CEO whose suit cost more than a mid-size sedan, pointed a polished Italian leather shoe at a mangled, engineless chassis from the 1960s. He laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive over the roar of the downpour, as he turned to the crusher foreman. "That car is dead, Frank," Sterling announced, his voice dripping with the unearned arrogance of a man who viewed history as an overhead cost. "It's taking up space. Move it to the teeth of the machine. I want it flat by noon." Elias Thorne, standing 10 feet away in his faded blue janitor's jumpsuit, gripped the handle of his mop bucket so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't look at the CEO. He looked at the chassis, a jagged, skeletal remains that everyone saw as a failure. But Elias didn't see junk. He saw a stack of dimes welds and a microscopic hand-stamped serial number, 001 Alpha, that the world's most expensive scanners had missed.
"Wait," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to stop the rain. He stepped into the light, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "I'll give you $5,000 for the scrap. It's every penny I have." Julian Sterling froze, his smirk transforming into a mask of pure mockery. "You're buying a grave, Elias, not a car. You want to spend your savings on a pile of oxidized failure?" Elias didn't blink. He reached out and touched the cold, wet steel, whispering just loud enough for Julian to hear. "It's only dead if you don't know how to listen to the steel. And this engine hasn't even started to sing yet." His warning was a ghost in the cold machinery. Vanguard Motors was a clinical cathedral of obsidian glass and brushed aluminum, a place where the air was filtered to a surgical grade and the silence was only ever broken by the rhythmic clicking of high-heeled assistants or the subsonic hum of world-class servers. Inside the primary executive garage, a high-tech sanctuary where the world's most powerful investors gathered, the morning light was weaponized by hyper-reflective floors, illuminating the Apex One engine like a holy relic on a pedestal of carbon fiber.
Elias Thorne moved through this temple of ego like a glitch in the software. A 42-year-old silhouette of dense, functional muscle draped in a pilling navy jumpsuit that carried the permanent scent of industrial lavender and old iron. He was the biological filter, a man whose existence was tolerated only because the high-priced robots hadn't yet learned how to identify a coffee ring on a mahogany desk or a smudge of grease on a plexiglass partition. As Julian Sterling, the 34-year-old CEO who inherited his father's empire but none of his humility, stepped onto the display stage to launch the Apex One, the room leaned in with a collective, hungry greed. Julian was the master of ceremonies, his charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like armor, and he moved with a predatory confidence that suggested he had already solved the future. When Elias moved to mop a spill near the primary cooling intake, Julian paused mid-sentence, his eyes flicking toward the janitor with a flash of visceral, physical revulsion. With a smirk designed for the cameras, Julian stepped off the stage and intentionally walked through a nearby puddle of muddy runoff from a recently arrived test vehicle, his leather loafers tracking a dark, jagged trail across Elias's freshly polished floor.
"You missed a spot, Elias," Julian announced, his voice amplified by the room's hidden acoustics, drawing a dry, sycophantic ripple of laughter from the investors. Julian didn't stop there. He leaned into the mockery, gesturing toward Elias's salt-stained work boots and scarred, steady hands, as if he were a primitive specimen of a dying species. "You see this, gentlemen? This is why Vanguard is pivoting toward total automation. This man represents the friction of the past, the peasant-level mindset that believes a machine needs a soul to run. Elias here thinks he's a mechanic because he knows how to tighten a bolt, but in my world, he's just the background noise we haven't filtered out yet." To solidify the humiliation, Julian tossed his silk handkerchief onto the muddy floor
and pointed a manicured finger at the tires of his personal Ferrari, which sat gleaming under the halogens. Actually, since the press is here to see perfection, why don't you show them how a real Thorn earns his keep? Get on your knees and hand wash those tires. Use the handkerchief. I want them to see their reflection in the rubber. And I want you to remember that men like you are the reason the past stays buried in the dirt. The cameras flashed, capturing the image of the legendary Apex CEO standing over the lowly janitor.
Elias didn't argue. He didn't defend the fact that he understood the thermal expansion coefficients of the Apex 1 better than the PhDs who designed it. He simply knelt, his large, calloused hands taking the silk cloth, and began to scrub the rubber in the same silence that had defined his last 3 years. Julian looked down at him, his expression a mask of pure, concentrated disdain, believing he had established the permanent hierarchy. But as Elias looked at the floor, he saw the rhythmic vibration of the perfect engine, a microscopic thermal oscillation that Julian was too arrogant to hear. The mockery was a fuel, and as the CEO walked away to receive his applause, Elias Thorn knew that the future of Vanguard Motors was already beginning to fracture from the inside out, and the dead car in the scrapyard was the only thing that would be left standing when the noise finally stopped. The bus ride back to the Low District always felt like a slow-motion descent from a mountain of glass into a valley of rust, a 40-minute journey where the glittering spires of the Vanguard Empire faded into the gray, salt-eroded brickwork of a world that didn't photograph well. Elias Thorn stepped off the bus at 6:15 p.m., his boots heavy with the residue of Julian's mockery, his navy jumpsuit a pilling polyester weight against his ribs. He walked past the flickering street lamps of 4th Street to a cramped apartment that smelled of burnt sugar from the bakery below and the sharp, clinical ozone of medical equipment. Inside, the world was silent, save for the rhythmic, electronic hiss-click of a portable oxygen concentrator. Chloe Thorn was 7 years old, but she possessed the unblinking, evaluative gaze of a person who had already negotiated with death. She was sitting at a small table, her small frame swallowed by a faded sweater, focused on an intricate drawing of a high-pressure manifold. Elias felt the familiar, jagged ache in his chest, the secret burden that dictated every calorie he burned. 5 years ago, Elias hadn't been a janitor. He had been the chief engineer for Sterling rival Icarus Dynamics, the man who had perfected the master arc ignition sequence. He was a man of patents and six-figure bonuses, a visionary whose life was shattered when his wife, Sarah, was killed during a high-velocity prototype test. The official report called it mechanical failure, but Elias had found the ghost trace in the software, a deliberate corruption of the cooling gates that pointed straight to a younger, desperate Julian Sterling, who had been an intern under Elias's father. Elias had weaponized his life to fight the subsequent legal battle, but Julian's family had deeper pockets and longer shadows. They didn't just win, they erased Elias's professional history, froze his assets, and blacklisted him from the industry he had helped build.
Elias had taken the janitor job at Vanguard, not because he had given up, but because the facility was 4 blocks from the specialized pediatric cardiac wing where Chloe received the treatments that kept her heart beating. He reached into his collar and pulled out a small, heavy object on a blackened silver chain, a vintage brass ignition key, the teeth worn smooth by a decade of hope. As Chloe looked up, her breathing labored, but her eyes reef blue and defiant, Elias placed the key in her hand, the cold metal a physical anchor between the ghost he used to be and the man he was forced to become. "The boy at school said that car in the shed is just a pile of bones, Dad," she whispered, her fingers tracing the key's grooves. Elias knelt beside her, his scarred hands framing her fragile shoulders, his voice a low, terrifyingly steady rumble of absolute conviction. "A real engine never dies, Chloe. It doesn't care about the rust on the outside or the opinions of men in expensive suits. It just waits in the dark, gathering its strength, waiting for someone with enough heart and enough truth to wake it up. 30 days, sweetheart. In 30 days, we're going to show them that a thorn doesn't just clean the floor. We build the world." For 30 nights, The moon was the only silent witness to the metallurgical seance occurring within the salt-rotted walls of a rented, corrugated shed on the edge of the shipyard, a space where the air was thick with the scent of high-grade kerosene, scorched iron, and the heavy, honest sweat of a man who had nothing left but his expertise. Elias Thorne didn't sleep. He lived in a world of tolerances, his scarred hands a blur of surgical precision and brute force as he systematically disassembled the 001 Alpha chassis, treating the oxidized magnesium-lithium alloy not as scrap metal, but as a living record of his father's stolen genius. He wasn't merely fixing a car. He was reconstructing the legendary lost isothermal combustion sequence, a technology that utilized an adiabatic expansion chamber to maintain a constant thermal peak during the power stroke, essentially creating an engine that didn't just produce thrust, but willed it into existence without the violent, efficiency-robbing shock pulses of standard combustion. Using vintage, hand-calibrated micrometers and a set of custom-ground valves he had machined himself during his lunch breaks, Elias tuned the 001 Alpha to a frequency that the world hadn't heard since his father's workshop was raided. He performed a zero-point balance on the crankshaft, measuring the centrifugal mass to within 3/millionths of an inch, all while Julian Sterling's experts at Vanguard Motors were currently drowning in their own digital arrogance.
Across the city, in the sterile billion-dollar labs of Test Bay 7, the new Apex 1 engine was beginning to self-destruct in real time. The PhDs and software architects were huddled around holographic monitors, staring at a jagged, unstable red line that represented a terminal thermal oscillation. The engine was hunting for its center, the vibration so violent that it was creating micro-shear fractures in the primary bearing races. Elias felt it first. While mopping the high-gloss executive floor at 3 a.m., he had stopped his bucket, his boots planted firmly against the marble, and felt the subsonic tremor through the very foundation of the building. He didn't need a diagnostic tablet to understand the failure mode. He knew that Julian had stolen his father's early blueprints, but lacked the magnesium stabilization formula required to handle the heat load of a Mach-scale rotation. It was the ultimate irony. The Apex 1 was a corrupted, stolen ghost of the very machine Elias was currently waking up in a dirt floor shed. As the 30th night reached its peak, Elias stood over the 001 Alpha, his face a mask of grease and exhaustion, and placed his hand on the primary intake. He felt the cold truth of the steel, the stack of dimes welds glowing under the worklight like a promise fulfilled. He knew that the investors were gathering, that Julian was preparing to lie to the world once more, and that the Apex 1 was minutes away from a catastrophic crystalline fracture that would vaporize the CEO's reputation.
Elias reached into his collar, pulled out the vintage brass ignition key he had worn as a talisman, and slid it into the hand-cut dash of the 1967 prototype. He didn't ask for luck. He didn't pray for a miracle. He simply turned the key. And in that moment, the low district was shattered by a sound that defied the laws of modern engineering, a deep, resonant, and perfectly stable roar that didn't vibrate, didn't smoke, and didn't apologize. The 001 Alpha wasn't just running, it was singing the song of a thorn, a billion-dollar secret that had been buried in a grave for 40 years, now rising from the rust to dismantle the man who thought a janitor was too small to see the truth. The 38th floor of the Vanguard Motors headquarters was no longer a place of business. It was a high-tech stage designed for a corporate coronation, a theater of mass-produced delusion where the air was ionized.
Below him, in the heart of Test Bay 7, the Apex 1 engine sat like a dark, pulsating monolith on a carbon fiber pedestal, surrounded by a phalanx of investors and board members who had traded their souls for a piece of the future of flight. Julian didn't see the danger. He didn't hear the intergranular stress in the titanium or the harmonic slip that Elias Thorne had detected weeks ago while mopping the very floor they stood on. He was looking at the primary wall screen, a 40-foot expanse of high-definition obsidian, where the Apex 1's vitals were represented by a pulsating green line that Julian had forced his engineers to optimize through software fraud. "Gentlemen," Julian announced, his voice amplified by the room's hidden speakers, projecting a confidence that was fundamentally suicidal.
What you are seeing is the final death of the physical limit. The Apex One doesn't just meet expectations, it redefines the physics of possibility, achieving a zero vibration power stroke at 99% capacity. But as he hit the command to transition into the overclock phase, the reality of the machine began to dismantle the lie of the CEO. The subsonic thud Elias had warned about in his mopped notes, the ones Julian had wiped away with a mocking laugh, suddenly erupted into a visceral, bone-shaking scream that made the crystal flutes of champagne in the investor's hands hum with a terrifying frequency.
The Apex One wasn't hunting for its center anymore. It was fighting a terminal feedback loop as the stolen, flawed geometry of the combustion chamber entered a phase of crystalline fracture. On the holographic display, the emerald green turned into a jagged, screaming red, and the air in the bay was suddenly filled with a white, blinding mist of vaporized liquid nitrogen as the manifold seal failed exactly as the lowly janitor had predicted.
"The manifold is at critical!" Dr. Aris shrieked from the technical hub, his fingers blurring over a terminal that was now flashing a sea of red error codes. "Julian, the thermal logic loop is irreversible! The core is going to burst!" Julian roared for them to force the flow, to triple the pressure, his ego-driven panic ignoring the laws of thermodynamics that were currently grinding his empire into dust. But the silence that followed was more violent than the explosion. For 5 seconds, the god of Vanguard died a digital death as the Apex One's primary bearing race seized, punching a magnesium alloy piston straight through the carbon fiber casing, effectively vaporizing $200 million of R&D in a cloud of scorched iron. The investors scrambled back, their polished veneer shattered by the sight of industrial failure, leaving Julian standing alone at the railing, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish as the building's lighting shifted to a final, steady emergency amber. He was staring at the wreckage of his reputation, realizing that he didn't own a single second of the time remaining, and that he had mocked a man whose hands were currently holding the only version of the truth that still worked.
And then it happened. A sound began to rise from the rain-slicked street 40 stories below. Not the jagged, unstable shriek of a failing machine, but a deep, resonant, and perfectly stable harmonic roar that didn't vibrate the glass. It sang through it. It was the sound of a zero-point balance, a rhythmic, industrial heartbeat that carried the unmistakable signature of a thorn. Julian whipped around, his face a mottled shade of gray as the elevator chimes rang with a soft, ironic melody. The doors slid open, and Elias Thorne stepped out. Not in a blue jumpsuit, but in his grease-stained canvas jacket, his eyes reef blue and immovable. He didn't look at the board. He looked at Julian. And then he pointed through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the driveway. Pulling up to the curb was the 1967 prototype, the car Julian had called dead weight, the car he had ordered to the crusher. It wasn't rusted. It was restored to a shimmering white-blue finish that looked like it had been carved from the sky itself. It wasn't leaking. It was idling with the mechanical perfection of a dream that refused to stay buried. Elias Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver founder's coin. The metallic clink on the mahogany table sounding like a gavel strike on Julian's career. "The car isn't dead, Julian," Elias said, his voice a low, terrifyingly steady rumble that bypassed Julian's panic and settled in the marrow of everyone.
"The car is the only thing in this building that is truly alive. And for the last 30 days, you've been worshipping a stolen ghost, while the man who built the floor was busy waking up the king." The catalyst of failure had been triggered. The experts had been revealed as frauds. And as the restored 1967 prototype roared one final defiant salute from the street below, the investors turned as one away from the CEO and toward the janitor. Integrity had arrived on time, and Julian Sterling realized then that when you stop respecting the grease, you eventually find yourself drowning in the oil. Julian Sterling's face was no longer a mask of corporate perfection. It was a mottled, incoherent map of instant regret and desperate, predatory denial as he lunged across the mahogany table, his manicured fingers trembling as he pointed at the shimmering white-blue prototype idling in the rain 40 stories below. "Security! Why is this man in my boardroom?" Julian screamed, his voice reaching a pitch that betrayed the terror beneath his unearned prestige. "He's a janitor! A common laborer who stole Vanguard property from the scrapyard! He's a thief who compromised the integrity of Test Base 7! I want him in zip ties, and I want that scrap metal back in the crusher before the news cameras arrive!"
But the two security guards who had followed Elias into the room stood like statues of scarred granite, their eyes fixed not on their boss, but on the man in the grease-stained canvas jacket. They had been with the company for a decade, and they recognized the master's hand in the way Elias Thorne stood, the way he didn't even blink as Julian screeched his accusations. Elias walked to the head of the table, his chair, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled a thick, legal-bound folder from the inner pocket of his jacket, tossing it onto the table with a heavy, final thud that silenced the room. "You talk a lot about property, Julian, but you still don't understand the difference between owning a building and owning the mind that designed it," Elias said, his voice a resonant, low-frequency rumble that seemed to physically stabilize the air in the room, bypassing the CEO's panic and settling in the marrow of the board members. He flipped the folder open to the first page, revealing a yellowed, hand-drawn blueprint with a stamped seal from the U.S. Patent Office dated 1967, signed in the bottom right corner by Marcus Thorne. This isn't scrap metal, and it isn't Vanguard property. This is the Thorne Vanguard 001-Alpha, the only functioning proof of the isothermal combustion sequence, a technology that was licensed to this company under a strict manual oversight protocol that your father swore to uphold. Elias stepped into Julian's personal space, the honest scent of kerosene and iron overwhelming the billionaire's expensive perfume.
"The reason your Apex 1 engine just vaporized its own core isn't a software glitch or a thermal oscillation. It's because you're a fraud. You stole my father's early blueprints for the adiabatic chamber, but you lacked the magnesium stabilization formula required to handle the heat load of a Mach-scale rotation. You tried to digitize a physical law you didn't understand, and in your arrogance, you deleted the only safety margin that kept the engine from becoming a bomb." One of the senior board members, Arthur Sterling, Julian's own uncle, leaned forward, his hand shaking as he touched the original patent. "Elias Thorne? My God, the chief engineer we blacklisted? The one we were told caused the Monza crash?" Elias's eyes darkened until they were the color of deep water before a storm. "I didn't cause the crash, Arthur. Your nephew here, as a desperate intern, sabotaged the cooling gates on Sarah's car to ensure his father's optimization software looked like a miracle. I spent 5 years cleaning your floors, waiting for this car, the original 1967 Master, to resurface from the private warehouse you tried to hide it in. I knew that the day you tried to launch your stolen future, you would find out that a Thorne doesn't just build machines. We build truths." To seal the verdict, Elias reached into his bag and pulled out a specialized diagnostic interface, plugging it into the boardroom's primary terminal. With a few rapid-fire commands, he performed a manual torque sync via the wireless telemetry from the prototype in the street. The investors gasped as the holographic display projected the data from the 001 Alpha, a perfect, zero-deviation power stroke that maintained a constant thermal peak, outperforming the $200 million Apex 1 in every measurable metric, without a single micro-shear in the bearings. The board members looked from the data to Julian, then back to Elias. They saw the experts slinking away, their high-priced tablets recording the slow-motion collapse of their own credibility, and they realized then that they weren't looking at a janitor. They were standing in front of the ghost of the machine, the man who owned the very oxygen they were breathing, because his mind was the only one that knew how to keep the world moving. The confrontation was over, the reveal was absolute, and as Julian Sterling collapsed into his chair, the reality of his instant regret finally hit him with the weight of a billion-dollar patent theft lawsuit. Integrity had arrived on time, and it was wearing a grease-stained jacket.
The justice delivered at Vanguard Motors was not a corporate negotiation. It was a total demolition of a fraudulent throne. As Julian Sterling was hoisted from his chair by the same security guards he had used to mock Elias 30 days prior, a team of high court process servers stepped from the shadows to deliver a terminal patent infringement lawsuit that would effectively liquidate Julian's personal assets by morning. The board of directors, finally waking from their digital stupor, stripped Julian of his unilateral authority and revoked his stock options for the reckless endangerment of the company's intellectual soul. The experts were purged, their contracts canceled without severance, leaving a vacuum at the heart of the empire that only one man could fill. Arthur Sterling, representing the majority shareholders, didn't offer Elias a job. He offered him a seat at the helm as the new chief technical officer, a position that came with a non-negotiable $15 million IP settlement and back royalties check. For Elias Thorne, the catharsis wasn't found in the money or the title, but in the silence that followed the departure of the man who had tried to erase his history.
He didn't buy a mansion or a fleet of supercars. He didn't even buy a new suit. The first thing he did was call the specialized cardiac wing at St. Jude's and pay the full balance for Chloe's complex heart surgery, ensuring her future was as stable as a zero-vibration power stroke. In a final act of quiet, surgical retribution against the world that had tried to bury him, Elias used the remainder of his settlement to purchase the entire pediatric cardiac center, renaming it the Sarah Thorne Institute of Mechanical and Biological Integrity. The man who had been called a biological dead end in the executive lobby was now the foundation of the very institution that saved his daughter's life. The single dad was no longer a ghost mopping the floors of the wealthy. He was the master of the machine, the architect of a new legacy, and the owner of the only car in history that truly sang. The white prototype hummed with a rhythm that defied the salt wind, its engine a stable, harmonic heartbeat as it carved through coastal fog. Elias Thorne held the wheel with one hand, his scarred fingers finally at rest, while Chloe sat beside him, the vintage ignition key clutched in her hand like a trophy. Behind them, the spires of Vanguard Motors were nothing more than fading lights in a rearview mirror. The world is full of people who look at rust and call it death, worshipping polish while they ignore the truth under the hood. They mistake a job title for a man's worth and a suit for a man's mind. But remember this, the man you mock today might be the only one who knows how to fix your world tomorrow. Integrity doesn't ever need a corporate title. It just needs a steady hand and 30 days of truth.